A wave of generosity spread through the church. Believers gave without hesitation, their hearts united in faith. One by one, they laid their offerings before the apostles, trusting in God's provision. No one held back, at least that's what it seemed. But beneath the surface, deception lurked. A couple, Ananias and Sapphira, had made a choice. They had sold their land like the others, yet something was different. Behind closed doors, in whispered voices, they crafted a secret, a scheme that would put their very souls in danger. In the early days of the church, a powerful movement was spreading across Jerusalem. The apostles, led by Peter and John, were performing miracles, healing the sick, and boldly proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thousands were being added to the faith daily, and the community of believers was marked by an extraordinary spirit of unity, generosity, and love. Among them, there was a deep conviction that everything they owned was not their own, but belonged to God and His people. Many wealthy believers, moved by the Spirit, sold their lands and possessions, bringing the money to the apostles to distribute to those in need. One notable example was Barnabas, a man from Cyprus, who sold a field and laid the full proceeds at the feet of the apostles. Acts 4:36-37. His selfless act was greatly admired by the community, setting a powerful example of generosity and devotion. Amid this wave of generosity, a couple named Ananias and Sapphira saw an opportunity, not just to participate, but to gain recognition and praise without making the full sacrifice. They too owned a piece of property, and after discussing it privately, they decided to sell it. However, unlike Barnabas, they chose to hold back part of the money for themselves while pretending to give the full amount to the apostles. It was a premeditated act of deception, one they both agreed upon. Perhaps they feared giving away everything, or maybe they desired admiration from their fellow believers while keeping their financial security intact. Regardless of their reasoning, their hearts were not pure before God. With the money in hand, Ananias confidently walked into the assembly of believers. The room was likely filled with excitement and reverence as people worshipped and listened to the teachings of the apostles. He approached Peter, placing the money at his feet, acting as though he had given the entire proceeds of the land. But Peter, filled with the Holy Spirit, immediately discerned the deception. The room fell silent as Peter's gaze fixed upon Ananias. His voice was firm, carrying the weight of divine authority. "Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and keep back part of the price of the land for yourself? While it remained unsold, was it not your own? And after it was sold, was it not in your own control? Why have you conceived this thing in your heart? You have not lied to men but to God." Acts 5:3-4. The gravity of Peter's words struck the assembly. It became clear that the issue was not about withholding money, but about lying to God. Ananias had not been compelled to give anything. His land and its proceeds had always been his to decide upon. But instead of being honest, he had tried to deceive God himself. As the truth settled in, a wave of terror overcame Ananias. His heart pounded, his breath became short, and suddenly, his body collapsed to the ground. God had struck him down instantly. A great fear gripped the entire assembly. No one had expected such a severe consequence. The power and holiness of God were suddenly evident in a way that shook the hearts of all who were present. Without delay, the young men of the church came forward, wrapped his body, and carried him out for burial. The entire event had happened so swiftly that few had time to fully grasp its meaning. About 3 hours later, Sapphira, unaware of what had happened to her husband, entered the gathering. Perhaps she had been preparing herself for the praise and admiration they would receive for their generosity. She looked around, expecting warm smiles and grateful faces, but instead, there was an unusual stillness, a tension in the air she couldn't quite place. Peter, still standing, turned his piercing gaze toward her. He gave her a chance to come clean, but also to test the truth in her heart. "Tell me, Sapphira," he asked, "Did you sell the land for this price?" "Yes, for that price," she responded confidently, reinforcing the lie. Peter's expression did not change. "How is it that you have agreed together to test the Spirit of the Lord? Look, the feet of those who buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out as well." Before she could speak, her body weakened, her vision blurred, and she too collapsed to the floor, dead. The same young men who had buried Ananias returned, saw her lifeless body, and carried her out to be buried beside her husband. By this time, news of what had happened spread like wildfire. The believers who had once been joyful and bold now experienced a holy fear of God's power and presence. So great fear came upon all the church and upon all who heard these things. Acts 5:11. This was not just a story of punishment. It was a demonstration of God's holiness. The early church was being built on truth, faith, and honesty. If deceit and hypocrisy were allowed to take root, the entire movement could have been corrupted. God had shown that His presence was not to be taken lightly. God sees the heart. Ananias and Sapphira thought they could fool the apostles and the church, but God knew their true intentions. There is nothing hidden from Him. Lying to the Holy Spirit is a serious offense. They did not just lie to people, but to God Himself. The Holy Spirit is not to be tested with falsehood. Hypocrisy in the church is dangerous. The early church was built on purity and truth. Hypocrisy, if left unchecked, could have weakened its foundation. Generosity must be genuine. Giving should come from the heart, not from a desire for recognition or approval. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. This event instilled a deep reverence for God in the early church. True worship includes honoring God's holiness. The story of Ananias and Sapphira is one of the most sobering accounts in the New Testament. It reminds us that while God is merciful and loving, He is also just and holy. Their fate was not due to greed alone, but because they attempted to deceive God Himself. For the early church, this moment set a precedent. God's presence was real, powerful, and not to be trifled with. Even today, this story stands as a stark reminder. Honesty before God is not optional. It is essential.